The lane that led to Iris Campbell's cottage was lined with hedges in bloom, but the flowers in her own garden had long since withered. It was the morning of the 28th of March, a date that had been etched into her heart like a carved stone. For the past 13 years, a wicker basket of red roses had always appeared on her doorstep. No card, no note, just the unmistakable scent of memory and devotion. But this morning, the doorstep was empty. Iris stood in her kitchen, a chipped mug of tea cooling in her hands. She glanced at the clock. 8:15. The delivery always came by 8. Always. A silence filled the room, heavier than the ticking of the old brass clock above the hearth. She had not spoken the tradition aloud to anyone in years, perhaps out of fear that acknowledging it might somehow make it vanish. Outside, the wind stirred the bare branches of the apple tree, casting shadows that danced like forgotten ghosts across the wall. She stepped out onto the front path, slippers brushing the stone, eyes scanning the gate. No delivery van. No visitor. Only the sound of birdsong and the faint whisper of the fields beyond. Back inside, the kettle clicked off, ignored. She opened the drawer by the back door and pulled out the calendar she kept for herself, not the one guests saw on the fridge, but the old one, the secret one. Circles around certain dates, written in small careful letters, wedding anniversaries, the day Graham died, the birthdays of people no longer here. And always, the 28th of March, with a red dot. And then she saw something else. Tucked between the pages was a cream-colored envelope, thin and elegant, bearing her name in penmanship she didn't recognize. Iris turned it over in her hand. No stamp. No postmark. Someone had left it by hand. She opened it slowly, fingers trembling just enough to make her pause. The handwriting inside was unfamiliar, slanted, refined, and deliberate. I know you've been waiting. Forgive the change. Some truths can't arrive in baskets. She read the line again, heart racing. Then she folded the paper, gently, and slipped it back into the envelope. Someone knew. Someone had been watching. And for the first time in years, the silence around her wasn't peaceful. It was thick with the weight of something coming. The next morning, Iris walked into the village. The spring air was soft against her face, carrying the scent of damp earth and the faint sweetness of new blossoms. She hadn't been to the Saturday market in weeks, preferring the solitude of her home. But something about that letter, that strange, quiet message, pulled her out from behind her walls. The market was already alive with sound and color. Stalls overflowing with early tulips and jars of honey. Children with chocolate-streaked smiles tugging at their parents' sleeves. A man in a brown hat played a tune on a wooden flute. Everything looked as it always had. Except Iris felt different. She moved past the cheese stall and paused near the flower stand, where the same young woman stood trimming stems. The red roses were there, fresh and open. Just like the ones that had appeared on her doorstep for over a decade. Lovely, aren't they? The woman said with a smile. Iris nodded, her gaze fixed. Do you deliver these? Sometimes. But we've had a new man handling that route. Older chapter quiet. Bit posh, if you ask me. Started just before Christmas. Iris thanked her and continued through the crowd, but the words followed her like footsteps. She had never seen anyone bring the roses. They simply appeared. Like magic. Like memory. Near the end of the row of stalls, someone was packing books into a wooden crate. A tall man with silver hair, dressed in a wool coat too fine for market work. As she passed, their eyes met. He hesitated. And then, softly, he said, Mrs. Campbell. Iris stopped. Her heart leapt in confusion. No one called her that anymore. Not here. Not for years. You don't remember me, he said gently. But I knew your husband. Graham. A long time ago. Iris studied him. There was something in the voice. A trace of a laugh she once knew, from smoky summer evenings, from clinking glasses and garden chairs. He extended a hand. Miles Ashbury. She did remember now. Not all at once, but in fragments. He had been at their wedding. A friend from Graham's university days. Then he had simply vanished from their lives, like a chapter torn from a book. He smiled faintly. I'm sorry to surprise you. But I believe we have something we need to talk about. And without knowing why, Iris nodded. Daniel stopped a few paces in front of her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of 28 years pressed down between them like a stone. Gran, he said finally, his voice low and guarded. You shouldn't be here. Eleanor met his gaze, her expression calm but unreadable. And yet, here I am. Daniel glanced over his shoulder. People were beginning to stare. He stepped closer, his tone hushed but tense. This isn't the place. We can talk later. Later, she echoed softly. Yes, I've heard that before. His jaw clenched, but he didn't reply. The woman at his side, the bride, was now whispering to an usher, casting sharp glances in Eleanor's direction. Eleanor stood her ground. I won't stay long, she said quietly. But I needed to see you. And to give you this. She withdrew the folded envelope from her coat pocket and held it out to him. He didn't take it. What is it? He asked, suspicion lacing his words. A letter your mother wrote, she said. For you. Daniel hesitated. His eyes flicked to the envelope, then back to Eleanor. Why now? Eleanor looked past him, toward the glittering room. Her voice dropped. Because the man standing beside your future father-in-law once stood beside me. A long time ago. And your mother knew it. The words sank into the air like ink in water. Daniel's brows furrowed, his lips parted slightly. Behind him, the music shifted, the string quartet now played a romantic waltz, signaling the start of the pre-ceremony gathering. But in that moment, the room blurred. For Eleanor, there was only one face she couldn't tear her eyes away from. Rupert Norwood. He hadn't changed much. Graying now, but still tall, still full of charm. And still a liar. He turned slightly, catching sight of Eleanor at last. Their eyes locked across the crowd. His expression didn't falter, no panic, no surprise, only a brief flicker of recognition before he turned back to his daughter and laughed at something she had said. It was that nonchalance, that perfect performance, that had once made her fall for him. And that same charm had led to the ruin of her daughter. Eleanor reached forward and pressed the letter into Daniel's hand. Read it. Not now, not here. But soon. Daniel took it reluctantly. If this is some attempt to. But Eleanor had already turned. She walked past the well-dressed guests, their eyes darting toward her and quickly away again. She walked past the flowers and silverware and music. Past the glimmer of polished shoes and whispered disapproval. Her steps were steady, her head held high. She didn't look back. Bristol smelled of old stone and river mist. Iris stepped off the train and drew her coat closer, her fingers trembling slightly beneath her gloves. It had been years since she last traveled this far from home. The city moved at a different pace, louder, faster, but somehow lonelier. People passed her in waves, their eyes locked on screens, their ears tucked behind headphones. She held a small envelope in her bag. Inside was a photograph Miles had found. It showed a man standing by a workshop bench, sleeves rolled up, a half-finished leather-bound book in his hands. His expression was calm, focused, and unknowingly familiar. The name on the workshop sign was William Fern. The directions led her through quiet side streets, past cafes and antique shops, until she reached a painted blue door with an oval glass window. Through it, she could see shelves stacked with worn books, gilded spines glowing faintly in the dim light. A chime rang above as she pushed the door open. The scent of parchment and wood polish hit her at once. A man looked up from behind a counter, his shirt cuff stained with ink. "Good morning," he said, polite, reserved. Iris stepped forward. "I'm looking for William Fern." "You've found him," he replied, brushing his hands clean with a cloth. "How can I help?" She hesitated. Her voice caught in her throat. She had rehearsed a dozen versions of this moment on the train, but now they all felt too dramatic, too fragile. "I'm a friend of someone who knew your parents." He looked curious but not alarmed. "That's rare. I never knew them." "I know," she said softly. She glanced around the shop. It was warm, neat, quietly beautiful. A place of precision and care, just like the letters in the basket, just like the roses placed so deliberately. "You've been sending flowers," she said, not a question. He blinked. "I'm sorry." "Red roses." "Every March." "To a cottage in Rye." A pause. Then he nodded, slowly. "Yes. I have. I don't know why. I found the address years ago, in some old records. Something about it felt right." She smiled, a faint, painful curve. It was right. William looked at her more closely now, studying the lines of her face, the way her hands trembled as she touched the edge of the counter. "Have we met before?" She didn't answer that. "Not yet." William led her to the back of the workshop, through a narrow hallway lined with framed botanical prints and shelves stacked with boxes of faded labels. At the end of the corridor was a small room with a single window and 2 armchairs, aged but clean. "It's quieter here," he said, gesturing for her to sit. Iris eased into the chair, placing her bag on her lap. Her hands wouldn't stay still. "I don't really know how to start," she murmured. William folded his hands together, mirroring her unease. "You're not the first person to come here with something to say." She studied his face, the shape of his jaw, the softness around the eyes, the way he looked at people as if expecting stories. Her throat tightened. There were traces of Graham there, but also something entirely her own. Something she hadn't dared imagine for 4 decades. "I was 17, she said. "Living in Durham. My parents sent me away when they found out. I gave birth in a convent hospital. They didn't let me hold you." His lips parted slightly, but he said nothing. "I never knew where you went. I wasn't allowed. They told me it was better that way." He blinked, slowly. "I was adopted when I was 4 months old. I grew up near Bath. It was quiet. Kind people. But I always knew I didn't belong." She nodded. "I never stopped thinking about you." William stood and crossed to the window. He stared out at the grey rooftops, at the seagulls slicing through the sky. His shoulders rose and fell in silence. "I found a file," he said at last. "A few years ago. After my adoptive father passed away. I saw your name, just once, on a medical form. Iris Holloway. It meant nothing at the time, but I kept it. And later, I started sending the roses. I don't know why." A tear rolled down her cheek. "Because something in you remembered." They sat in the hush of that little room, full of shadows and dust and the weight of things never spoken. It was not a joyful reunion. It was not full of tears or embraces. But it was something steady. Real. And slowly, between them, it began to take shape. They parted that afternoon with no promises, only the quiet understanding that something had changed. Iris returned to Rye by the late train, the countryside slipping past the window like pages in a book she had once forgotten how to read. The town greeted her with its usual hush, cobbled streets, the faint hum of the sea in the distance, and the familiar creak of her garden gate. She stepped into the house and lit a single lamp. The air inside smelled of thyme and dried lavender. Everything was in its place, untouched since she left. But she was not the same. That night, she didn't sleep. Instead, she sat in the conservatory, wrapped in her shawl, watching the pale blue light of dawn spill across the sky. Birds began to stir in the hedges, their calls thin and hopeful. Iris looked out at her garden. Overgrown. Tired. Still bearing the bones of what it had once been. By mid-morning, she was kneeling in the soil, sleeves rolled up, fingers digging through weeds and dead leaves. She hadn't touched the flower beds in over a year. What had once been a riot of color was now a tangled mess of nettles and thistle. Still, she worked. Silent. Determined. She planted new seeds. Ranunculus. Cornflower. Snapdragons. Flowers her daughter had once loved. She pulled the broken trellis free and leaned it against the shed to mend later. She cut back the ivy that had overtaken the garden wall. By the time the sun began to dip, the garden had changed. Not finished. But changed. That evening, she found herself writing again, not in a diary, but on paper meant for someone else. The letter began simply. William. I don't know how to be a mother to you, not after all this time. But I would like to try. If you'll let me. She folded the letter and placed it in an envelope, just as the last light faded from the hills. She didn't know what would happen next. But for the first time in years, she felt something bloom within her. Not joy. Not yet. But perhaps the beginning of it. It was a week before Iris saw him again. The days passed slowly, filled with the scent of turned soil and the sound of garden shears. She waited without calling, without writing again. The letter had gone, dropped into the red postbox outside the village shop, her hands trembling as she let it slip through the slot. Since then, silence. On the 7th evening, the wind shifted. She was standing at the kitchen sink, rinsing her hands after repotting a row of lavender, when she heard the gate creak. Her breath caught. Not many people used the front gate anymore. She turned off the tap, dried her hands, and opened the door. There he was. William stood at the bottom step, holding his cap in one hand. He looked older than she remembered from Bristol, not in years, but in weight. In thought. In hesitation. Hello, he said quietly. Iris stepped aside, and he entered. They didn't speak at first. Not as they moved through the hallway, not as she led him into the conservatory where late sunlight cast golden patterns through the glass. She poured tea without asking, as if he had always been someone she knew how to serve. I got your letter, he said, once the cups were filled. She nodded. I wasn't sure if I should send it. I'm glad you did. He looked around the room. It was full of small, worn things. Books with cracked spines. A cushion stitched with the name Lucy. A faded photograph in a frame, Iris, Graham, and a girl with sunlight in her hair. He picked it up gently. She was your sister, Iris said softly. You would have liked her. I think I would. The moment stretched. Then he set the photo down and looked at her again, not with the searching of a stranger, but the fragile hope of someone trying to find their place. I don't know what comes next, he admitted. But I don't want to walk away. Iris smiled, tired and full of something she couldn't name. Then don't. He stayed until the sky turned violet and the garden was silent again. When he left, he didn't take the path straight to the gate. He paused near the flower beds, kneeling without a word, and began to clear the ivy she had left untouched near the wall. Spring deepened. The days grew longer, the air warmer, and the garden, once brittle and broken, began to breathe again. Colors returned in cautious bursts. Pale yellow primroses. Blush pink tulips. And at the edge, near the old trellis William had helped mend, the first red rosebud bloomed. Iris stood at the window that morning, watching it open to the sun. It had been weeks since William's visit. Since then, he had returned again and again, never staying too long, never rushing the space between them. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they worked in silence. There was no declaration, no sudden reconciliation. Just presence. Just time. One afternoon, he brought her a box. "I've been restoring this," he said. It belonged to someone named Lucy. She opened the lid slowly. Inside were notebooks, drawings, a locket. Her daughter's handwriting danced across the pages, sketches of flowers, poems, small thoughts scribbled in margins. Iris pressed her hand to her mouth. She hadn't seen these in years. "Where did you find them?" she whispered. "In a box at a charity shop in Bristol. I don't know how they ended up there. But I recognized the name." She nodded. Lucy gave those to a friend before she left for university. She never asked for them back. They sat together in the conservatory, going through each page. William didn't say much. He just listened. And when Iris wept, quietly, without shame, he placed a hand on hers and didn't let go. The days that followed were quieter. Not emptier, but settled. One morning, William arrived with a pot of tea and a bag of tools. He fixed the fence without being asked. Another day, he repainted the garden bench. And when the first proper bloom appeared, he stood beside Iris in silence, both of them watching the petals unfurl. The roses returned that year. Not in secret baskets, not in silence. They grew from the earth, nourished by hands that had once trembled and now learned to hold. They were not a mystery anymore. They were home.